Doug took me to one of the best archaeological museums in the world to show me some of the unique artifacts that relate to Genesis.
Well, the events of the Bible are unfolded in the ancient Near East, so all of these lands are extremely important to understanding how and what took place in the biblical text.
So this picks up these events we've been looking at in Genesis, from creation and the flood, and now we're to the dispersion of mankind out of Noah and his family.
Exactly. And the dispersion would have taken place somewhere in this mountain range to the northwest of Mesopotamia. And what we see in the biblical text in the narrative is that a number of people have migrated down to southern Mesopotamia, the land of Shinar, and moved toward the process of urbanization, city living. And that's the famous Tower of Babel. Absolutely. Do we know where that is? There are about 7 or 8 Babels, cities of Babel, in the ancient area of Mesopotamia. And so one at a time, I've studied all of those areas and found only one that meets all the criteria of the famous site of the Tower of Babel. And that is the site of Eridu, which is in southeastern Mesopotamia. We have signs of the expansion to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west, all the way as far as Egypt. And when you say evidence, that is the artifacts that we find in these archaeological digs? Exactly. There's an enormous amount and very specific kinds of material culture that attest to this expansion of people that I'm connecting to the post-Babel dispersion. Here are the beveled rim bowls, these two, which is that rimkin brick that we see up there, and those 2 spouted jars. All of these diagnostic forms of pottery and material culture, they're found throughout the Near East. The Bible describes an event that's not just the confusion of language, but it's the dispersing of people far from that city. And because we see language or the written expression of language just pop up out of nowhere, and then different languages being represented through cuneiform script or through hieroglyphic script or other means. So you do not have a universal plan that's followed among all of the languages. You see great diversity in the forms of grammar from language to language, even in ancient languages. It seems then that the event recorded in Genesis about the Tower of Babel, that's a very, very critical event for archaeology. It is. So all of this fits perfectly with what we would see as the biblical account of how languages took place. It's really the only way of explaining this. So the integrity of biblical history ultimately is justified by the expression of these languages. Now, most of us think today of a tower, the kinds of things we see in big cities, big straight walls. Is that what they were building? Well, essentially, it's a variation of a pyramid. And there were 4 sides to it and several stairways that would go up to the top. At Eridu, we have a temple that existed in 18 different phases. And in every phase, it grew in its size and its complexity. And that final temple, that final phase of the temple, it was abandoned immediately, right at the time of the late Uruk expansion. Catacorner to the temple was an absolutely enormous platform. Do you think that could be the foundation of the Tower of Babel? Absolutely, and I would suggest to you that this late Uruk expansion, where this technology began, was something that spread with the people. We find forms of these ziggurats all around the globe. We find them in China, we find them in India, we find them in various parts of the Americas. We find them all over. Well, obviously we have evidence here of civilization and people beginning to gather together in communities, even cities. Do we have any other evidence of that? Absolutely. We can move forward to the time of Abraham because we know that Abraham lived at the site of Ur, which was also in southern Mesopotamia, at the end of the 3rd millennium BC. That brings us to the end of Genesis chapter 11. Exactly. In fact, you see some pottery, some cuneiform tablets, all dating to the period of the 3rd dynasty of Ur. It's amazing just as we're sitting here thinking about that, thinking about Abraham and that this represents the culture and the civilization that he lived in. It's a great tie to that record in Genesis 4. It is fascinating, and it gives you a feeling of putting your hands around the events that go on in the biblical text. When I look back through history,
I realized each of these cultures had been impacted by the events recorded in Genesis.